Before humanity conquered the planet, it almost vanished beyond Africa. Not once, but repeatedly. Long before the story we are taught in school, before modern humans spread across continents and reshaped the earth, earlier waves of our species stepped out into the world and disappeared. No empires, no descendants, no memory, just silence in the archaeological record, and a question science avoided for decades. How many times did humanity try to leave and fail? History remembers the survivors. Biology does not forget the dead ends. We are taught that Homo sapiens left Africa once, succeeded, and never looked back. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, a small population crossed into Eurasia, adapted, expanded, and became the ancestors of everyone alive today. It is a clean, comforting story. It suggests progress was inevitable, that our dominance was written into nature itself. But inevitability is usually an illusion created after survival. Long before the successful expansion, there were other departures. Earlier migrations that reached the Levant, Arabia, even parts of Europe. These people were anatomically modern humans. They hunted, used tools, controlled fire. They were us in every biological sense, except one. They did not last. For a long time, archaeology treated these early traces as errors, misdated layers, contaminated samples, outliers that could be safely ignored. The dominant model had no room for failure. If modern humans appeared outside Africa too early, it broke the timeline, so the evidence was pushed aside. Then genetics arrived. When researchers began comparing ancient DNA with modern genomes, an uncomfortable pattern emerged. The genetic lineages of living humans did not trace back to those early migrants. Instead, they point to a later, narrower expansion. Earlier populations had left no measurable genetic legacy. They had expanded and been erased. Stone tools in the Levant dated to over 120,000 years ago. Human remains in Greece that predate the official migration by tens of thousands of years. Campsites in the Arabian Peninsula showing long-term occupation by modern humans well before the accepted timeline. These were not brief scouting missions. They were sustained attempts to settle new lands. And yet they ended. Climate shifted. Deserts expanded. Ice ages advanced. Ecosystems collapsed. Small, fragile populations found themselves isolated in hostile environments with no margin for error. Without large numbers or stable migration corridors, extinction came quietly. Not in a single catastrophe, but through slow attrition. This is humanity's first failure. Not a moral failure, a biological one. The realization forces a profound shift in how we understand our past. Our species was not guaranteed to succeed. Intelligence did not protect us. Toolmaking did not save us. For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens hovered on the edge of disappearance, attempting expansion after expansion, only to be pushed back or wiped out entirely. The successful migration we celebrate today was not the first attempt. It was the last one that worked. In this sense, modern humanity is not the product of inevitability, but of survival through repeated collapse. Our existence rests on a narrow genetic bottleneck, a single dispersal that barely succeeded where others failed completely. And buried beneath our DNA is a forgotten truth. The world we inherited was not conquered on the first try. In the next stage of this investigation, genetics becomes the detective, tracing the invisible lines of ancestry, revealing which migrations vanished, which survived, and why only one version of humanity remained to tell the story. To understand how humanity failed before it succeeded, scientists had to abandon the surface of history and descend into something far smaller, the molecule that remembers what stone and bone often forget. DNA does not care about legends, survival stories, or cultural pride. It records only one thing: who reproduced and who did not. For decades, archaeology alone could not resolve the mystery. Stone tools could tell us where humans had been. Fossils could tell us when. But neither could answer the crucial question: did those early populations survive long enough to become part of us? Genetics finally provided a way to interrogate the past without relying on narratives. When researchers began analyzing modern human genomes, they noticed something strange. Despite the vast diversity of cultures and appearances across the world, human genetic variation was surprisingly narrow, far narrower than expected for a species that had supposedly spread and diversified over hundreds of thousands of years. This narrowing pointed to a bottleneck, a moment when the entire future of humanity passed through a very small population. If earlier migrations had succeeded, their genetic signatures should still be visible today. They are not. Instead, most non-African populations trace their ancestry back to a single, later expansion. The earlier waves left traces in soil and stone, but not in living bloodlines. From a genetic perspective, they are dead ends. The investigation deepened when scientists separated human ancestry into different inheritance paths. Some parts of our genome recombine every generation, mixing endlessly. Others act like time capsules. One of these is mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mother to child. Another is the Y chromosome, passed from father to son. Together, they form two independent genealogical records, maternal and paternal, stretching back tens of thousands of years. When these markers were mapped globally, a stark pattern emerged. Nearly all non-African mitochondrial lineages cluster around a narrow time frame consistent with a single successful dispersal. The same is true for Y chromosome lineages. Earlier branches exist, but almost entirely within Africa. Outside it, the genetic tree abruptly simplifies. This means something uncomfortable. Early Homo sapiens reached Eurasia multiple times, but their lineages vanished so completely that they left no detectable descendants. The failure was not partial. It was total. Ancient DNA added another layer. When genetic material was recovered from archaic humans like Neanderthals and Denisovans, it revealed limited interbreeding with the later successful migrants. But there was no comparable genetic contribution from earlier modern human populations outside Africa. They did not mix, persist, or merge into later groups. They disappeared before they could matter genetically. Why? Climate emerges as the first suspect. Early expansions coincided with brief warm periods that opened corridors out of Africa. When those windows closed, populations found themselves trapped in marginal environments. The Levant oscillated between fertile refuge and arid barrier. Arabia shifted from green to desert. Europe plunged into cold phases hostile to small, isolated groups. Population size mattered more than intelligence. Small bands are vulnerable to random events, droughts, disease, resource collapse. Without large, interconnected networks, extinction does not require catastrophe. It happens through silence. Fewer births, fewer survivors, one generation at a time. Genetics shows this brutally. Failed populations leave no gradual fade in the record. They simply stop. Another factor was competition. Early modern humans entering Eurasia were not alone. Neanderthals had occupied these regions for hundreds of thousands of years. They were adapted to cold climates, established in stable territories, and well-suited to local ecosystems. Small human groups arriving intermittently may have been outcompete or absorbed without leaving a lasting genetic trace. Only later, When a larger, more resilient population expanded rapidly, did modern humans establish dominance? And even then, survival was not guaranteed. What genetics reveals is not a heroic march outward, but repeated probing failures. Humanity tested the world multiple times, encountered limits it could not overcome, and retreated into extinction. The successful migration was different in one critical way: scale. Genetic data suggests that the final dispersal involved a larger founding population, better connected routes, and a longer window of environmental stability. Once numbers reached a certain threshold, survival became statistically possible. Not assured possible. From that point forward, expansion accelerated. Populations split, adapted, and diversified. Cultural complexity increased. Technologies improved. But none of that explains the earlier failures. Those failures happened despite intelligence, despite tools, despite fire. Which leads to an unsettling conclusion. What saved humanity was not superiority, but timing. A brief alignment of climate, geography, and population size allowed one migration to persist where others collapsed. Had conditions shifted slightly differently, the genetic investigation would be studying a species that never existed, us. In the next stage, the story narrows further, focusing on how small surviving populations shape the genetic landscape of the future, and how bottlenecks and isolation left permanent marks on human biology that are still visible today. Once genetics revealed that most early human expansions failed, a deeper and more uncomfortable question emerged. Why did the final one survive at all? What separated the last migration from every previous attempt was not intelligence, not innovation, and not even adaptability in the way we usually imagine it. It was survival through extreme fragility. The successful expansion of Homo sapiens was not driven by a vast, powerful population. Genetic evidence suggests the opposite. The group that ultimately populated the world was small, dangerously small. Estimates vary, but many models point to a founding population numbering only in the low thousands, possibly even hundreds. This was not a triumphant army of humans sweeping across continents. It was a bottleneck. A genetic bottleneck occurs when a population is reduced to such a small size that much of its genetic diversity is lost. What remains is not a representative sample of the species, but a distorted fragment, shaped by chance more than by fitness. The fact that all modern humans descend from such a bottleneck means something profound. Much of what defines humanity today exists not because it was optimal, but because it happened to survive. This realization changes how we interpret the success of our species. The surviving population carried only a subset of the genetic variation that once existed in Africa. Entire lineages, traits, and adaptations vanished forever with the failed dispersals. The humans who succeeded were not necessarily better adapted. They were simply the ones who passed through a narrow window of opportunity without collapsing. Genetic markers reflect this clearly. Compared to other large mammals with wide geographic ranges, humans are strikingly homogeneous. Two humans from opposite sides of a planet are genetically more similar than two chimpanzees from neighboring forests. This uniformity is the fingerprint of near extinction. The world was not conquered by diversity. It was inherited by survivors. As these small populations expanded outward, they carried the bottleneck with them. Each new migration wave created further founder effects, situations where new populations were established by a handful of individuals. With every split, genetic diversity narrowed again. Traits that were rare became common. Others disappeared entirely. This process explains why certain genetic features appear disproportionately in modern populations, not because they conferred advantage, but because they were present in the founders who happened to survive. Importantly, this also reframes how we think about adaptation. Much of what allowed humans to thrive later may have emerged after survival was secured, not before. Cultural innovation accelerated once population sizes increased and networks stabilized. Language, symbolic behavior, and complex tools flourished when extinction pressure eased, not during the most fragile phase. During the earlier failed dispersals, humans had tools and fire, but lacked numbers. Small populations are not just vulnerable to climate and competition. They are vulnerable to randomness. One harsh winter, one prolonged drought, one generation with fewer births. Extinction does not require dramatic catastrophe. It requires bad luck. The successful migration appears to have benefited from a rare alignment. Climate conditions opened viable corridors out of Africa for longer periods. Coastal routes may have provided stable resources. Populations may have remained connected rather than isolated, allowing gene flow and recovery from local losses. This does not make the survivors superior. It makes them fortunate. Even interactions with other hominins reflect this fragility. Genetic evidence shows limited interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, suggesting contact occurred, but cautiously, sporadically, and without overwhelming dominance. Early modern humans were not instantly replacing others. They were negotiating survival at the margins. The image of inevitable replacement collapses here. For tens of thousands of years, modern humans were just one vulnerable species among several. The bottleneck also means that modern humanity is not a continuation of all that once existed. We are the remainder, a compressed version of something broader, richer, and ultimately lost. Our species today does not represent the full range of early Homo sapiens, only the fraction that passed through the final filter. This has a disturbing implication. If survival hinged on chance as much as capability, then the line between existence and non-existence was thin. A slightly colder climate, a slightly longer drought, a delayed expansion by a few thousand years, and the investigation would be examining fossils without descendants. There would be no witnesses left to tell the story. The genetic scars of that near failure remain within us. Reduced diversity, shared vulnerabilities, a species shaped by contraction before expansion. Humanity's global success is built on a foundation of extreme biological risk that almost ended the experiment entirely. In the final stage of this story, the focus widens again, from genes to meaning. Because once failure, bottlenecks, and chance are acknowledged, the idea of human destiny itself begins to unravel. The final chapter of humanity's expansion is often framed as a victory. A species leaves its birthplace, survives new environments, outcompetes rivals, and spreads across the planet. From this distance, the story looks deliberate, almost purposeful. But when the earlier failures are restored to the narrative, that interpretation becomes difficult to defend. What genetics and archaeology reveal is not destiny, but contingency. Humanity did not rise because it was meant to. It rose because, after repeated collapses, one fragile population happened to persist long enough to expand. Every earlier attempt vanished without legacy. Every earlier success was temporary. The modern world exists not because failure was impossible, but because it was narrowly avoided. This reframes the concept of progress itself. Progress is usually imagined as cumulative, each generation building on the last, each expansion strengthening the species. But the deep record shows something closer to erosion. Advances were made, then erased. Knowledge was gained, then lost with the people who carried it. The line from early Homo sapiens to modern civilization is not continuous. It is broken, stitched together by survival rather than improvement. The first failure forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Intelligence alone does not guarantee survival. Tool use does not guarantee success. Even adaptability has limits. When populations fall below critical thresholds, extinction becomes a matter of probability, not weakness. Homo sapiens crossed that threshold multiple times and did not recover. Only once did it work. The genetic bottleneck that defines modern humanity is not a badge of honor. It is a warning preserved in biology. Our species came within reach of disappearance, not because it lacked ability, but because the environment closed in faster than populations could respond. Survival depended on factors no individual controlled: climate shifts, geography, timing. This understanding also reshapes how we think about identity. Humanity is often portrayed as a unified lineage marching forward through time. In reality, we are the descendants of a single surviving branch, not the heirs of every human who ever lived. Entire versions of humanity existed and ended without descendants. They mattered, but they did not persist. We are not the sum of all human history. We are what remained. This perspective strips away the illusion of inevitability that often surrounds modern dominance. The world was not conquered by intelligence alone. It was inherited after repeated failure. The success we celebrate was not guaranteed, repeatable, or secure. It was contingent and therefore fragile. And that fragility has not disappeared. The same forces that erased earlier expansions still exist. Climate instability, resource collapse, population fragmentation. The first failure was not unique to the past. It is a pattern embedded in the rules of biology. Large-scale survival requires more than capability. It requires resilience at the population level, maintained over time. The story hidden beneath our genomes is not one of triumph, but of narrow escape. Humanity's first failure was not the last time extinction loomed. It was the first time we came close enough to leave permanent scars in our DNA. The uncomfortable conclusion is this: modern humanity exists not because failure was overcome, but because it was postponed. And the record shows clearly how easily the story could have ended before it ever began.